Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the positive pregnancy test in her trembling hands. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing louder than the last. She stared at the 2 pink lines, willing them to disappear, but they remained, glaring back at her like an unspoken truth she couldn't ignore. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was Justin. "Hey, what's going on? You said it was urgent." Sophie hesitated before typing back. "Can you come over? I need to tell you something." Minutes later, the sound of gravel crunching under tires signaled Justin's arrival. She met him at the door, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong?" he asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Sophie swallowed hard. "I'm pregnant." Justin froze. His mouth opened, then closed as if he were trying to find the right words but couldn't. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "Are you sure?" She nodded and handed him the test. He stared at it, his brow furrowed. "We'll figure this out, okay?" he said, wrapping his arms around her. "I'm not going anywhere." His words brought a brief sense of relief, but reality quickly set in. Sophie's father had barely spoken to her since her mom passed away. He spent most of his time at work or locked in his office, and she doubted he'd react well to the news. "We need to tell my dad," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Justin tightened his grip. "We will. But first, let's make sure everything's okay. We should see a doctor." The next morning, Sophie sat nervously in the passenger seat of Justin's car as they pulled into the clinic's parking lot. "You ready?" Justin asked. She shook her head. "Not even a little." He reached over and took her hand. "We'll get through this. Together." Inside, the waiting room was quiet except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Sophie stared at the other patients, wondering if any of them could tell she was terrified. A nurse called her name, and her stomach dropped. Justin squeezed her hand and followed her down the hallway to the exam room. Dr. Parker entered, his warm smile slightly easing Sophie's nerves. He appeared to be in his early 40s, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes. "What brings you in today?" he asked. Sophie glanced at Justin, who gave her an encouraging nod. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice trembling. Dr. Parker's smile softened. "Congratulations. Let's start with some questions, and then we'll do an ultrasound to check how far along you are, okay?" Sophie nodded, gripping Justin's hand tightly as Dr. Parker began asking about her medical history. "Any health concerns I should know about? Family history of complications during pregnancy?" Sophie hesitated. "My mom passed away from cancer last year." Dr. Parker's expression shifted slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'm sorry to hear that." After taking notes, he led Sophie to the ultrasound machine. "This gel might feel a little cold," he warned before spreading it across her stomach. The room fell silent as he moved the probe, and then, suddenly, the sound of a faint heartbeat filled the air. Sophie's eyes welled up with tears. Justin squeezed her hand and smiled. "That's your baby," Dr. Parker said softly. For the first time since taking the test, Sophie felt a flicker of hope. But it didn't last long. Dr. Parker's expression grew serious as he studied the screen. "What is it?" Sophie asked, panic rising in her voice. "I'd like to run a few more tests," he said carefully. "Just to be sure everything's okay." The flicker of hope vanished, replaced by a wave of fear. Sophie looked at Justin, and in his eyes, she saw her own terror reflected back at her. "Is something wrong with the baby?" she asked. Dr. Parker hesitated. "I can't say for certain yet. Let's not jump to conclusions until we have more information." But Sophie's mind was already racing. She had barely come to terms with being pregnant, and now there was a chance something could be wrong? Justin wrapped his arms around her as tears began to fall. "We'll get through this," he whispered. "I promise." As they left the clinic, Sophie felt the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She glanced at Justin, who tried to smile but couldn't hide the worry in his eyes. For the first time, Sophie wondered if she was strong enough to face what lay ahead. Sophie couldn't shake the unease that settled in her chest as she and Justin stepped into the clinic the following week. The waiting room felt colder this time, the fluorescent lights harsher. Her fingers tightened around Justin's hand, and he gave her a reassuring squeeze. "We've got this," he whispered. Sophie managed a weak smile, but her stomach churned as the nurse called her name. Inside the exam room, Dr. Parker greeted them with his usual calm demeanor. "It's good to see you both again," he said, gesturing for Sophie to sit on the exam table. "Let's go over a few things before we continue." Sophie nodded, but her palms were sweaty, and her heart felt like it was about to burst. "I know the last visit left you with a lot of questions," Dr. Parker began, flipping through her file. "I ran the additional tests, and while most of the results look good, there's something we need to discuss." Sophie's breath hitched. "What is it?" Justin asked, leaning forward. Dr. Parker looked directly at Sophie. "We found a condition called placenta previa. It means the placenta is covering your cervix, which could lead to complications later in the pregnancy." Sophie's heart sank. "Complications? Like what?" "There's a higher risk of bleeding, especially as the pregnancy progresses. It could require bed rest or even an early delivery." Sophie's hands trembled. Justin reached out and held them. "But the baby's okay, right?" Justin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Parker offered a small smile. "So far, the baby is healthy. But we'll need to monitor both of you closely. It's something we can manage as long as we're careful." Sophie exhaled, trying to absorb everything. She was only 14. How could she handle this? "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. Dr. Parker nodded. "That's the right mindset. And I'll be here to guide you every step of the way." He continued explaining the precautions: no heavy lifting, no strenuous activity, and plenty of rest. But Sophie's mind drifted. She thought about her mom and how she would have known what to say, what to do. When the appointment ended, Sophie and Justin walked out to the car in silence. It wasn't until they were halfway home that Justin finally spoke. "We'll figure this out, sophomore. You're not in this alone." Tears welled in her eyes. "I know. But it's not just me I'm worried about. It's the baby." Justin reached across the console and took her hand. "We're going to be okay. All three of us." She wanted to believe him. She really did. Sophie sat on her bed, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the ultrasound picture Dr. Parker had given her. The tiny, blurry shape in the image was her baby, a life depending on her. She traced the edges of the photo with her fingertip, her thoughts swirling like a storm. Justin sat beside her, his arm draped protectively around her shoulders. "You haven't said much since we left the clinic," he said softly. She sighed. "I'm scared, Justin." "Me too," he admitted. "But you're strong, sophomore. I know you'll get through this." Sophie shook her head. "You don't understand. I don't feel strong. I feel broken." Justin turned to face her, his eyes searching hers. "You're not broken. You're overwhelmed, and that's okay. But you don't have to do this alone. I'm here. Always." Tears welled in her eyes, and she leaned into him, letting his words wrap around her like a warm blanket. "What if something happens to the baby? Or to me?" Justin's grip tightened. "It won't. Dr. Parker said we'll be careful, and we will. Whatever it takes." Despite his confidence, Sophie could hear the tremor in his voice. He was scared, too. And the weight of that fear only made hers heavier. Later that evening, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, fiddling with the ultrasound picture while her dad moved around the room. He barely looked at her, mumbling a quick hey before opening the fridge. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to blurt it out and get it over with, but her throat felt like it was closing. "Dad," she finally managed. He turned, holding a bottle of water. "Yeah?" Her mouth opened, but the words refused to come out. Instead, she shook her head. Never mind. Her dad gave her a curious look but didn't press. He took his water and disappeared into his office, leaving her alone with the unbearable silence. The next day, Justin showed up at her house after school. "I've been thinking," he said, stepping inside. "Maybe we should start planning, like, baby stuff. Cribs, clothes, diapers." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "We can't even tell our parents, and you're already thinking about cribs?" Justin grinned sheepishly. "I'm just trying to focus on the positive." Sophie appreciated his effort, but the reality was too heavy for optimism. "What if they kick me out?" she asked. "What if your parents make you leave me?" Justin stepped closer. "They won't. And even if they do, I'll figure it out." "I'm not leaving you, Sophie." She wanted to believe him. She really did. But the doubts kept creeping in, whispering worst-case scenarios that left her breathless. Later that night, Sophie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Memories of her mom flooded back, her laughter, her warm hugs, the way she brushed Sophie's hair before bed. "What would you do, Mom?" she whispered into the darkness. Tears slipped down her cheeks as the ache of missing her mom mingled with the fear of what lay ahead. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. It was Justin. "You okay?" She wiped her eyes and typed back. "No. But I will be. Call me if you need me. I love you, sophomore." For the first time that day, a small smile tugged at her lips. "I love you too." The next morning, Sophie and Justin returned to the clinic for another checkup. Dr. Parker greeted them with his usual calm demeanor, but Sophie couldn't help but notice the crease in his forehead as he reviewed her chart. "Any bleeding or pain?" he asked. Sophie shook her head. "No, but I've been really tired." "That's normal, especially with placenta previa," he assured her. "We'll keep monitoring you closely. The most important thing is rest." He paused, looking directly at Sophie. "I know this isn't easy. But you're doing great so far." She tried to smile, but her anxiety remained. "What if something happens?" Dr. Parker's voice softened. "We'll be prepared for anything. But right now, focus on taking care of yourself and your baby." Justin squeezed her hand. "See? We've got this." Sophie nodded, but deep down, the fear still lingered. That night, Sophie finally found the courage to leave a note on her dad's desk. "Dad, we need to talk. Please don't be mad." She didn't sign it. She just left it there and went to her room, her heart pounding. Minutes later, there was a knock at her door. "Sophie?" Her voice caught in her throat. "Come in." Her dad stepped inside, holding the note. "What's going on?" Sophie took a deep breath and stood up. "I'm pregnant." For a long moment, her dad just stared at her. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out. Tears streamed down Sophie's face as the door clicked shut. Justin called later that night, and she told him everything. "He'll come around," Justin said. "Give him time." But Sophie wasn't sure. All she knew was that time was running out, and she needed to be stronger than she felt. Sophie woke up to the sound of her alarm clock, but it felt different that morning, heavier. The conversation with her dad from the night before replayed in her mind like a bad dream. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't said anything at all. And somehow, that hurt more. She sat up slowly, her hands instinctively resting on her stomach. She couldn't stop thinking about the ultrasound photo tucked away in her drawer. That tiny heartbeat had already changed everything, even if it still didn't feel real. Justin texted her. "How are you this morning?" "I'm okay," she typed back, though she wasn't sure it was true. "Meet me at the clinic later? I want to be there for you." She hesitated before replying. "Okay." That afternoon, Sophie and Justin sat in the exam room again, the silence almost suffocating. Dr. Parker entered with a clipboard in hand, his expression neutral but focused. "Thanks for coming back so soon," he said, sitting across from them. Sophie's heart pounded. She braced herself for the worst. "I've reviewed all your test results carefully," Dr. Parker began. "There's something we need to talk about." Sophie's grip on Justin's hand tightened. "Your condition, placenta previa, is still a concern, but there's something else. We found signs of Rh incompatibility." Sophie's brows furrowed. "What does that mean?" Dr. Parker leaned forward. "It means your blood type is Rh negative, but your baby may be Rh positive. If your blood mixes with the baby's, your body could treat the baby's blood like a foreign substance and create antibodies against it." Justin's face paled. "Is that dangerous?" "It can be if it's not treated," Dr. Parker replied. "But the good news is, we caught it early. We can give Sophie an injection called Rh immunoglobulin to prevent complications." Sophie felt tears sting her eyes. "So the baby will be okay?" Dr. Parker smiled softly. "As long as we stay on top of it, yes." Justin exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "What's the next step?" "We'll monitor Sophie's blood regularly and administer the injection at the right time. It's not ideal, but it's manageable." Sophie nodded, but the relief was short-lived. Her mind was already spinning with what-ifs. What if something went wrong? What if the treatment didn't work? Dr. Parker seemed to sense her fear. "Sophie, I know this is a lot to process, but you're not alone in this. We'll take it one step at a time." Later that night, Sophie sat in her room, staring at the note her dad had left on the kitchen table. "I need time." It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She picked up her phone and called Justin. "Can you come over?" 15 minutes later, he was there, sitting beside her on the bed. "I can't stop thinking about everything the doctor said," Sophie admitted. "What if something happens to the baby? What if I can't do this?" Justin reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You can do this. And you're not doing it alone. We'll figure it out together, remember?" She wanted to believe him, but the fear still lingered. "I just wish my mom was here," she whispered. Justin pulled her into his arms. "I know. But you're so much like her, sophomore strong. Brave. She'd be proud of you." A week later, Sophie returned to the clinic for her injection. She held Justin's hand tightly as Dr. Parker prepared the shot. "This will help protect your baby," he assured her. Sophie winced as the needle went in, but the discomfort was nothing compared to the anxiety that had been eating away at her for days. "It's done," Dr. Parker said, smiling. "You're officially one step closer to a healthy pregnancy." As Sophie and Justin left the clinic, she felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. "See?" Justin said, grinning. "We've got this." Sophie smiled, but deep down, she knew the hardest part was still ahead. Sophie sat cross-legged on her bed, flipping through the old photo album her mom had left behind. The edges of the pictures were worn, and the colors had faded, but each image felt like a time capsule, a glimpse of the life Sophie missed so desperately. One photo caught her eye. It was her mom, smiling brightly in a hospital gown, holding a newborn Sophie in her arms. Her dad stood beside her, younger, happier. Sophie's fingers traced the image, longing to feel that warmth again. Her eyes drifted to the back of the photo where her mom had written, "Our miracle baby, thanks to Dr. Parker." Sophie froze. "Dr. Parker?" Her mind raced as she flipped through more pictures, searching for clues. She found another image, this time of her mom and a man in a white coat standing next to her dad. It was him, Dr. Parker, years younger but unmistakably the same man who now sat across from her in every appointment. Sophie's heart pounded. What did this mean? The next day, she sat nervously in Dr. Parker's office, the photo clutched tightly in her hands. Justin sat beside her, his eyes darting between Sophie and the picture. "Are you sure you want to bring it up?" he whispered. Sophie nodded. "I have to. When Dr. Parker entered, his usual calm demeanor faltered the moment he saw the photo in Sophie's hands. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "It's my mom," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "She said you helped her when she had me." Dr. Parker's eyes softened as he sat down across from her. "Your mom was one of my first patients," he admitted. "She was incredible, kind, strong, and so full of love." Sophie's throat tightened. "She never told me about you. But she wrote on the back of this picture that I was her miracle baby." Dr. Parker took a deep breath. "Your mom had complications during her pregnancy too. It was one of the hardest cases I'd ever handled, but she never lost hope. She always believed you were meant to be here." Tears filled Sophie's eyes. "I miss her so much." Dr. Parker leaned forward. "She'd be so proud of you, Sophie. And I promise, I'm going to help you through this, just like I helped her." Later that night, Sophie sat on the porch with Justin, staring up at the stars. "Can you believe it?" she asked. "Dr. Parker knew my mom. He saved her life, and mine." Justin smiled. "It's like fate, sophomore. He was meant to be here for you now." Sophie rested her head on Justin's shoulder, for the first time feeling a sense of peace. "Maybe," she said softly. "Maybe this is all happening for a reason." But as comforting as the thought was, Sophie knew their journey wasn't over yet. There were still hurdles to face, and the weight of the unknown hung heavy in the air. The following week, Sophie returned to the clinic for another checkup. She carried the photo with her, holding it like a good luck charm. Dr. Parker greeted her with a warm smile and guided her to the ultrasound room. "Let's see how baby's doing," he said, applying the gel to her stomach. The sound of the heartbeat filled the room, steady and strong. Sophie let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Everything looks good," Dr. Parker said. "You're doing an amazing job taking care of yourself and your baby." Sophie felt a wave of relief. "Thank you for everything." Dr. Parker smiled. "You don't have to thank me. Your mom trusted me to take care of you, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep that promise." Back at home, Sophie's dad finally knocked on her bedroom door. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Sophie sat up, her heart pounding. "Yeah." He stepped inside and sat down on the edge of the bed. "I've been trying to figure out what to say, and the truth is, I don't know. I'm scared, Sophie. But I'm also sorry." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean to let you down." Her dad shook his head. "You didn't. I let you down. After your mom. I didn't know how to handle things. But that's no excuse. I'm here now, and I want to be here for you, and for the baby." Sophie threw her arms around him, sobbing. "I need you," she whispered. "You've got me," he said, holding her tight. For the first time in months, Sophie felt like she wasn't carrying the burden alone. That night, she sat in bed, holding the ultrasound photo in one hand and the picture of her mom in the other. "I hope I can be as strong as you were," she whispered. Justin texted her. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she replied. "For the first time, I actually believe we can do this. We can. I love you, sophomore." "I love you too." Sophie placed the photos side by side on her nightstand and turned off the light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, she allowed herself to feel hopeful. Sophie sat in Dr. Parker's office, her hands trembling in her lap. The walls, painted in calming shades of blue, did little to ease her nerves. Justin sat beside her, his leg bouncing anxiously as he tried to stay composed. Dr. Parker's expression was calm but serious as he reviewed her latest test results. "The baby is still doing well," he began, pausing to glance up at Sophie. "But there's been a slight increase in your risk factors. The placenta previa hasn't shifted, and now there's some additional fluid buildup that we need to monitor closely." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "What does that mean?" Dr. Parker leaned forward. "It means that we have to be extra careful moving forward. we're looking at a higher chance of preterm labor. Justin tightened his grip on Sophie's hand. Can we stop it if it happens? Dr. Parker hesitated before answering. We'll do everything we can, but there are no guarantees. If the baby comes too early, there could be complications. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. I can't lose this baby, she said, her voice cracking. And we're not going to let that happen, Dr. Parker assured her. But we'll need you to be prepared for every possibility. That means more rest, more appointments, and possibly a hospital stay if things worsen. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. I'll do whatever it takes. Later that night, Sophie lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The thought of losing her baby terrified her more than anything. She reached for her phone and sent a text to Justin. Can you come over? I can't sleep. 15 minutes later, Justin climbed through her bedroom window like he had so many times before. What's wrong? He asked, sitting on the edge of her bed. I'm scared, Sophie admitted. What if something happens to the baby? What if I can't do this? Justin pulled her close, letting her rest her head against his chest. You're not alone, sophomore. I'll be here for every appointment, every scare, and every moment we need to fight for this baby. Sophie sniffled. You promise? I promise. The next morning, Sophie's dad found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her untouched breakfast. You're up early, he said, sitting down across from her. She nodded but didn't speak. After a long pause, she finally looked up. What if something happens to the baby? Her dad's expression softened. Then we'll deal with it together. Sophie blinked. You mean that? I do, he said. I may not have handled things well at first, but I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere. Relief washed over Sophie, but it was quickly replaced by determination. I need to be strong, she said. For the baby. Her dad reached across the table and squeezed her hand. And you will be. Just like your mom was. At her next appointment, Dr. Parker performed another ultrasound. Sophie held her breath as the screen flickered to life, showing the tiny figure growing inside her. The baby's heartbeat filled the room, steady and strong. Everything still looks good, Dr. Parker said, but his tone remained cautious. I want to see you twice a week from now on, just to be safe. Sophie nodded. Whatever it takes. Before leaving, she stopped at the door and turned back. Dr. Parker? He looked up from his notes. Yes? Thank you for everything. His smile was warm. You're welcome, Sophie. Your mom trusted me to take care of you, and I won't let either of you down. That night, Justin sat with Sophie on her porch swing, his arm wrapped around her as they looked out at the stars. Do you think we're ready for this? Sophie asked softly. Justin pressed a kiss to her temple. I think we're as ready as we can be. And no matter what happens, we're in this together. Sophie leaned into him, letting his words calm the storm inside her. I'm scared, Justin. I know, he said. But you're the strongest person I know, sophomore. And you're going to be an amazing mom. Sophie closed her eyes, letting herself believe it for just a moment. Sophie jolted awake, clutching her stomach. A sharp pain rippled through her body, stealing her breath. She gasped and reached for her phone. Justin, she whispered into the call, her voice trembling. Something's wrong. Within minutes, Justin was at her house, helping her down the porch steps and into his car. Her dad followed close behind, his face pale but determined. The hospital lights were blinding as Sophie was wheeled into the emergency room. Justin clung to her hand, whispering reassurances, but fear gripped her chest like a vice. Stay with me, he pleaded. Don't give up now. Dr. Parker arrived moments later, his calm presence anchoring Sophie's spiraling thoughts. We're going to take care of you, he said, his voice steady. But I need you to stay as calm as you can. Tears streamed down Sophie's face. Is my baby okay? Dr. Parker hesitated only for a second. We'll do everything we can." Hours passed in a blur of tests, machines, and whispered prayers. Sophie lay on the hospital bed, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Justin refused to leave her side, his fingers intertwined with hers. "I can't lose this baby," Sophie whispered. Justin bent down and pressed his forehead against hers. "You won't. We won't." Dr. Parker returned, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "The baby's heartbeat is still strong," he said. "But Sophie, we need to deliver early. Your body won't hold out much longer." Panic flared in Sophie's eyes. "It's too soon. The baby's not ready." "It's risky," Dr. Parker admitted, "but keeping the baby inside any longer could be even more dangerous." Sophie looked at Justin, her eyes pleading for strength. "We have to do this," he said firmly. "For both of you." The operating room was cold and sterile, but Sophie barely noticed. Her mind was consumed with prayers and desperate hopes as the nurses prepared her for surgery. Justin leaned over her, his voice soft but unwavering. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." Sophie gripped his hand. "Promise me, if something happens to me, you'll take care of our baby." "Don't talk like that," Justin said, his voice breaking. "You're going to be fine. Both of you." Tears spilled down Sophie's cheeks as the anesthesia began to take effect. Her last thought before drifting off was of her mom, praying that somehow she was watching over them. When Sophie woke up, the room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors. Her body ached, but the weight in her chest was heavier than anything physical. "Justin?" Her voice was barely a whisper. He appeared instantly, his eyes red-rimmed but filled with relief. "You're okay," he said, brushing her hair back. "And the baby?" Sophie's breath caught. "The baby?" Justin smiled through tears. "She's tiny, but she's strong. Just like her mom." Relief flooded Sophie's entire body, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to cry tears of joy. Later, Dr. Parker entered the room, holding a small pink blanket. Inside, Sophie saw the tiniest baby she'd ever seen, fragile but alive. "Meet your daughter," Dr. Parker said, carefully placing the baby in Sophie's arms. Sophie stared down at her, overwhelmed by love and awe. "Hi, baby girl," she whispered. "You're my miracle." Justin leaned in, his eyes filled with wonder. "She's perfect." Dr. Parker smiled softly. "She's a fighter, just like her mom." Sophie looked up, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. For everything." Dr. Parker's voice was thick with emotion. "Your mom would be so proud of you, Sophie. You fought for this baby, just like she fought for you." Sophie tightened her grip on her daughter, silently promising to protect her with everything she had. That night, Justin sat beside Sophie's hospital bed, their daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. "We did it," Sophie whispered. Justin smiled. "No. You did it. I just held your hand." Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder, exhaustion finally giving way to peace. "I love you," she said softly. "I love you too," Justin replied. "And I love her more than anything." Sophie looked down at her daughter, her heart full. For the first time in months, she felt hope, not just for herself, but for the future they would build together. Sophie woke to the faint hum of machines and the soft glow of morning light filtering through the hospital blinds. Her arms ached, not from pain, but from the emptiness where her baby had been the night before. Her heart raced as panic began to rise. "Where's my baby?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Justin stirred in the chair beside her, instantly awake. "She's okay," he said, standing quickly and reaching for her hand. "They took her to the NICU to keep her stable, but she's doing great, sophomore. The doctors said she's strong." Sophie let out a shaky breath, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I need to see her." Justin nodded. "I'll get the nurse." Minutes later, Sophie was carefully wheeled down the hall. Her heart pounded as she approached the NICU, the sound of monitors and hushed voices filling the air. When they reached the incubator, Sophie froze. There she was, tiny, fragile, but so alive. Her delicate chest rose and fell in perfect rhythm, and her tiny fingers curled into fists. Sophie pressed her hand gently against the glass, her tears falling freely. "She's beautiful," Justin whispered, his voice trembling. Dr. Parker appeared behind them, his expression warm. "She's stable and breathing well on her own," he said. "She's a fighter, just like I knew she would be." Sophie looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Can I hold her?" Dr. Parker smiled. "Absolutely." A nurse carefully lifted the baby from the incubator, placing her into Sophie's waiting arms. Sophie held her daughter close, marveling at how small and perfect she was. "Hi, baby girl," Sophie whispered, brushing her fingertip along the baby's cheek. "I've been waiting so long to meet you." Justin leaned in, placing his hand over Sophie's. "What should we name her?" Sophie thought for a moment before smiling. "Grace. Her name is Grace." Justin grinned. "It's perfect." Over the next few days, Sophie stayed by Grace's side, refusing to leave the NICU. She watched every breath, every tiny movement, as if afraid that the fragile life she fought so hard to protect might slip away. Justin brought her food and clothes, but she barely touched either. "You need to take care of yourself too," he reminded her gently. Sophie shook her head. "I'll rest when she's home." But Justin wasn't the only one worried. Dr. Parker stopped by frequently, his concern evident. "You're doing an amazing job, Sophie, but Grace needs you to be strong," he said one afternoon. "That means resting and eating." Sophie sighed. "I'm just scared, Dr. Parker. What if something happens while I'm not here?" He knelt beside her, his voice soft. "You have to trust the team taking care of her. And more importantly, you have to trust yourself. You're already an incredible mom." Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat. "Thank you for everything." "No need to thank me," Dr. Parker said with a smile. "This little miracle is the reason I do what I do." A week later, Grace had gained enough weight and strength to be discharged. Sophie carried her out of the hospital, her heart bursting with love and relief. Her dad was waiting at home, the living room filled with balloons and a banner that read, "Welcome home, Grace." Tears filled Sophie's eyes as her dad hugged her tightly. "I'm so proud of you," he said. "You're going to be an amazing mom." Sophie smiled. "I learned from the best." That night, Sophie sat in the nursery, rocking Grace in her arms. The room was quiet except for the soft creak of the chair and the gentle hum of the baby monitor. Justin entered, carrying a small box. "What's this?" Sophie asked. "A gift," Justin said, handing it to her. Inside was a locket. Engraved on the front were the words, "Faith, Hope, Grace." Sophie opened it to find two pictures, one of Grace and one of her mom. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Justin, it's perfect." He knelt beside her, resting his hand on Grace's tiny foot. "I wanted you to always remember how strong you are, and how much we love you." Sophie leaned down and kissed him. "Thank you for never giving up on us." "I never will," Justin whispered. As Sophie looked down at her sleeping daughter, she felt something she hadn't in a long time, peace. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she had everything she needed to face it. Grace stirred in her sleep, and Sophie smiled. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. "All three of us." Sophie sat on the couch, rocking Grace gently as the soft hum of the baby monitor filled the quiet living room. She watched her daughter's tiny chest rise and fall, marveling at how something so small could feel so monumental. Her dad entered the room cautiously, holding 2 cups of tea. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her one. Sophie smiled faintly and took the cup. "Thanks." He sat down beside her, the weight of unspoken words thick in the air. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about your mom lately." Sophie looked up, surprised. "Me too." He stared into his cup. When we found out she was pregnant with you, we were terrified. We weren't ready, at least, we didn't think we were. But your mom," he smiled wistfully. "She always had this way of making me believe we could handle anything." Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. "I wish she was here." Her dad nodded. "Me too. But you remind me so much of her, sophomore. The way you've handled everything, the fear, the responsibility, the love, you've shown so much strength." Sophie blinked back tears. "I didn't feel strong most of the time." "Neither did we," he admitted. "But we got through it. And so will you." Sophie glanced down at Grace, her voice soft. "I just don't want to let her down." Her dad reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "You won't. You already made her proud, sophomore. And you make me proud too." Later that evening, Sophie sat on the porch swing with Justin, Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms. "You look like a natural," Justin said, smiling as he watched her. Sophie laughed softly. "I'm still figuring it out. Aren't we all?" Justin teased, leaning in to kiss her forehead. Sophie rested her head against his shoulder. "I talked to my dad today. I think we're finally okay." Justin smiled. "I knew he'd come around." Sophie exhaled, finally letting herself relax. "I didn't. But it feels good to have him back." Justin wrapped an arm around her. "You deserve that, sophomore. You deserve all the support in the world." She looked down at Grace and smiled. "So does she." The days passed quickly as Sophie settled into her new routine. Late-night feedings, diaper changes, and lullabies became her world. And though it was exhausting, it was also beautiful. Her dad became more involved, offering to watch Grace so Sophie could rest or catch up on schoolwork. Justin was always there too, proving his commitment day after day. One afternoon, Dr. Parker stopped by to check on Grace's progress. "She's gaining weight perfectly," he said, smiling as he examined the baby. "You're doing an amazing job, Sophie." Sophie beamed, feeling a sense of pride she hadn't felt before. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said. Dr. Parker's eyes softened. "I think you would have done just fine. But I'm glad I could be here to help." That night, Sophie found herself sitting by Grace's crib, watching her sleep. The house was quiet, but Sophie's mind was busy. She thought about everything they had faced, fear, doubt, and the overwhelming uncertainty. Yet here they were, stronger than she ever imagined they could be. Justin joined her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. "You okay?" he asked. Sophie nodded. "I was just thinking about how far we've come." Justin smiled. "And how far we still have to go." Sophie looked at him, her eyes shining. "I'm not scared anymore." "Good," Justin said. "Because we're in this together. Always." Sophie leaned into him, her heart full. For the first time in what felt like forever, she believed it. The morning sunlight poured through the curtains as Sophie gently rocked Grace in her arms. The soft hum of the baby's breathing filled the room, a soothing melody that brought Sophie an overwhelming sense of peace. Her dad appeared at the doorway, leaning against the frame with a small smile. "She's growing so fast," he said, stepping inside and sitting beside Sophie on the edge of the bed. "I know," Sophie replied, brushing her fingertips along Grace's tiny fingers. "I feel like if I blink, I'll miss something." Her dad chuckled softly. "That's what parenting is, a constant fear of missing the little moments." Sophie glanced up at him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think I'm doing okay?" Her dad reached out and rested his hand on hers. "I don't think, Sophie. I know you're doing okay. You've been brave, patient, and loving. And Grace is lucky to have you." Sophie swallowed hard, emotions bubbling inside her. "Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done this without you." "And you don't have to," he said. "I'm here for both of you." Later that day, Sophie and Justin took Grace for a walk in the park. The sun was warm, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. parents with strollers and kids playing tag filled the space with life and laughter. Justin pushed the stroller while Sophie walked beside him, her hand brushing against his every now and then. "It's crazy, isn't it?" Justin said, looking down at Grace. "How much everything has changed." Sophie smiled. "Yeah. But I wouldn't trade it for anything." Justin stopped walking and turned to face her. "Me neither." He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "I know we're still figuring things out, but I want you to know that I'm all in, for you and for Grace." Sophie's heart swelled. "I believe you." Justin leaned in and kissed her softly. "We're going to be okay," he said. Sophie looked at Grace, her eyes shining. "We already are." That evening, Sophie stood in Grace's nursery, folding tiny clothes and organizing baby supplies. Her dad entered with a box. "I thought you might want this," he said, placing it on the dresser. Sophie opened it and gasped. Inside were keepsakes from her own childhood, a baby blanket, old photos, and a letter written by her mom. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the letter. "To my beautiful daughter," it began. Tears blurred her vision as she read. "If you're reading this, it means you've grown into the amazing woman I always knew you'd be. Life won't always be easy, but I hope you never forget how strong you are. You are my greatest gift, and I know you'll give the world so much love. Trust yourself, and never be afraid to lean on those who care about you. I'll always be with you, no matter what." Sophie clutched the letter to her chest, sobbing softly. Her dad stepped forward and wrapped her in a hug. "She would be so proud of you, Sophie. Just like I am." Sophie looked up, tears streaming down her face but a smile breaking through. "Thank you, Dad. For everything." That night, Sophie sat in the rocking chair with Grace in her arms. The room was dimly lit, casting soft shadows along the walls. She pressed a gentle kiss to Grace's forehead and whispered, "You saved me." Grace stirred slightly but remained asleep, her tiny hand curling around Sophie's finger. "You're my miracle," Sophie said. "And I promise to always be here for you." Justin appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame just like her dad had earlier. "She's perfect," he said softly. Sophie smiled. "She really is." Justin crossed the room and knelt beside them. "And so are you." Sophie's heart felt full of love, gratitude, and hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future didn't seem so scary. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something beautiful. Epilogue. Months later, Sophie stood in the park with Justin, watching as Grace giggled in her stroller. Her dad joined them, holding balloons for Grace's first birthday. Dr. Parker arrived shortly after, smiling warmly. "Look at her," he said. "A miracle." Sophie laughed. "She definitely is." As they all stood together, Sophie felt something she hadn't in a long time: peace. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but she also knew she wasn't facing them alone. With Justin, her dad, and Grace by her side, Sophie was ready for whatever came next.